My name is Matt Blois. You're watching Medically Necessary, a show about the healthcare supply chain. I talk with experts, business leaders, and researchers about how we get drugs, devices, and medical supplies to healthcare providers and patients. Today I'm talking with Mittal Sutaria and David Gillen with Vizient, a healthcare performance improvement company and a group purchasing organization. So if that term is unfamiliar to you, group purchasing organizations basically negotiate contracts for drugs and medical supplies on behalf of member hospitals. The idea is that this combined demand can lower prices when the hospitals go ahead and buy those supplies for themselves. And then Vizient also supplies a whole suite of other services to make hospitals more efficient. And so last year, the COVID-19 pandemic made this whole process of sourcing drugs and medical supplies a lot more difficult. Doctors and nurses were having a hard time getting personal protective equipment. Demand for certain drugs went through the roof. And those shortages really put a big focus on increasing the resiliency of the healthcare supply chain. And so this is, I don't know about you guys, but this is a term that I've heard over and over again. I've heard it at congressional hearings. I've heard it on corporate conference calls, seen it in newspaper headlines. It's everywhere. But I know for a company like Vizient, trying to increase supply chain resiliency isn't exactly a new idea. And we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and in January 2020, Vizient launched this new program that's called NovaPlus Enhanced Supply. It's basically aiming to make the supply of essential drugs and medicines more secure in the United States. And so today we're going to be talking about how that program works and then why Vizient thinks that's going to be something that makes the supply chain better. And so I'll be talking to Mittal and David about that and some of the other steps we can do to just achieve more supply chain resiliency. So one thing to note for listeners, there's a lot to talk about here. So we're going to break this conversation into two parts. So check back next Thursday to see the second half of this conversation. But Mittal and Brent, thanks for joining me on the podcast today. So let's start off just to talking about what Vizient is doing to increase resiliency. You have this new program called Nova Plus. So basically just give me a sense of how this program works and how it got started.
Sure. Great topic, Matt, and I'll go ahead and get started. So Nova Plus program is our private label program that really goes beyond the private label. It's been around for 30 plus years, and a lot of our all of our health system members have gotten a lot of benefit through that program. And our members have experienced, even though we've had the program in place for years, drug shortages have been around for decades as well. And we've been trying to solve for drug shortages for a while. And we thought because we have a high level of member commitment through our Nova Plus program, we wanted to use that as a foundation for launching our Nova Plus Enhanced Supply program, which we launched, as you said, last year. And we've been working on that program since 2019 to solve for the drug shortages. Actually, in 2019, we did a survey of our members that let us know that drug shortages cost them over $359 million in labor to manage alone. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to continue solving for it, and not just solve for it, but our goal and mission is to really end drug shortages. And that's why we launched this program, is because we've been working on it for a while, and we wanted to leverage what we have as a strong foundation through member commitment and really launch a program that benefits our members, our supplier partners, as well as solves for drug shortages at the same time.
Yeah. And so just to kind of make sure I understand sort of the newness, you said, this program's, or the Nova Plus sort of private label program has been around for a long time. And the new one that started in January 2020 is the sort of the enhanced portion. And it sounded like you had been working on it for a bit before that. So just before we move on, can I get one of you guys to explain to me just sort of like what's the difference between what was existing before, the predecessor program, and then what's sort of the new part?
Sure, Matt. Let me chime in on that. To Mittal's point, Nova Plus has been longstanding. We've changed the name over time, but it's been our private label. And why did we have a private label? It was really to get best price, best quality, best price. But then enter in COVID, the pandemic, and the realization was price was one factor, but really the dominant factor was supply assurance, availability. Can I get the product? It's great if you have it at a great price. Love that. But if I can't get the product, it doesn't matter. So we really shifted our focus away from just having a private label that gets that best price to doubling down on the supply assurance piece. So for example, when we look at Nova Plus, we're looking at usage rates. So let's take peak usage rates, and we're looking at 200% allocation on that peak usage rate. So aside from a lot of the supplier pedigree, which we could talk about, it really was making certain we had that slack in the line, making certain we had the products available for our members if they went through this program. So when you go from Nova Plus to this Nova Plus Enhanced Supply, what's the difference? It's the safety stock. It's that 200% allocation. It's the supply assurance.
Okay, that totally makes sense. So when I was learning about this program, I looked it up on the Vizient's website, and I saw that there's basically there's a couple of sort of ways that this program is supposed to work to increase resiliency. And I think you guys listed transparency, accountability, and commitment to supply as sort of the like foundations of how this program works. So I kind of want to go through those point by point. So let's start out with transparency, because I know this is another, in addition to resiliency, this is the other word that I hear mentioned over and over again. And I feel like sometimes it can be a little bit vague about what people mean. And so I'll be interested to hear what you guys have to say about it. But I know this has been, big focus from a lot of companies. And I know I've even been looking at what the FDA has been doing about how they've been trying to increase the transparency in the drug supply chain. So I guess, what are you doing to, you're making this effort to increase this transparency, gather data, but I'm interested to know, like, what are you doing to share that information with other parts of the supply chain? Because to me, it seems like if Vizient has transparency, that's good. That seems like an improvement, but it's, there's all these other players in the supply chain. So what are you guys doing to sort of increase that visibility, with other players in the supply chain? How's that work?
Yeah, Matt, that's a great question. So we've asked for elevated transparency for several years now from our suppliers, even through our bid processes. And that's really transparency into the raw material sourcing, as well as where the manufacturing plants are, where the drug produced, et cetera, right? And we've been we asked for that information, and we gathered that intel. What's unique about how Vizient shares that information back with the members or other parties is we take that information and we aggregate it to really understand, help our members understand if there are any specific challenges that they need to be concerned about. We utilize it in our sourcing strategies as well. So if we see a drug that is essential medication, so I'll give you a little bit of a definition of what we consider essential. Vizient last year actually came up with over 200 medications that it considers essential alongside with health systems. And for these medications, we ask for this level of data and evaluate if these medications are high risk at going short. Do we need to employ additional contracting strategy? And if there are potential shortages, we can have further discussions with our supplier partners, and there are targeted discussions, right? So if we know that there is a supply challenge in a specific geographic region, and we know that these are the suppliers that make the product or source the raw material for this product from these regions, then we can have more direct conversations rather than trying to have conversations across thousands and thousands of NDCs or SKUs in the drug for products. So really allowing us to focus in on where the problem might be and targeting that and having those conversations, and then relaying that information back to our membership in a transparent manner, as well as creating content and resources that allow them to make alternate product choices if necessary as well. So those are the ways we use that information today and share it.
Well, and you hit on an important point there that I think I want to just make sure I understand this. Sort of the way, this program works when it comes to transparency is you've got a list of medicines that are considered essential. We really don't want these to run out. They're for whatever, they meet the criteria to be on this list. And the goal is, because they're on that list, there's a higher, you guys are asking for more information than you would for drugs that are not on that list to make sure that you have better insight, better transparency into that specific list of essential drugs.
Absolutely. And that's because there are products that might have substitute or alternatives that you could utilize, but then there are drugs that there is no alternative to that, or there are drugs that are such high impact or so frequently utilized in a health system that being without that drug and trying to change every single protocol would be very challenging for a health system to undertake. So we've really we've actually placed the products in 3 different categories. There is high impact category, there's an acute category, and then there is chronic categories. So you think about your acute category drugs, your crash cart drugs that you can't go without. Your high impact drugs are your very frequent users, and chronic drugs are your oncology medications or chemotherapy medications. And again, those products are part of many protocols and many regimens that you can't really just make a really quick change. And that's why it's so important to monitor the supply chain around it, as well as creating resiliency around those products. And that's where our focus is for NOAA Plus Enhanced Supply Program as well.
Totally makes sense.
Hey, Matt,
David, were you going to chime in there? Yeah.
Yeah. So I agree with all the points Middle shared. One of the things that you asked that I think about is how are we sharing this with the members? How are we communicating this? And in particular, I want to break that into 2 pieces. One, I think it affects our contracting strategy. So for example, if you look at late 2020, early 21, if you look outside the pharma space and you look at just sharps containers as an example, that's a category that went in short supply. And when you look at our contracting on the surface, you would have said redundancy. We have 2 very different supplier contracts in place, but all of a sudden we find out in this breakdown that they both sourced a key raw material from the same raw material manufacturer, and the shortage hit both of them. So again, part 1 is we go down the path and make certain we have all of our ducks in a row, that we are actually accomplishing redundancy and resiliency in terms of sources of raw material, locations of finished good production, and even looking at origin to affect how is the shipping. Are they both being shipped by ocean going vessel? Can some be trained or trucked? So the contracting side, but then on the communication to members, which is really post-contract, a lot of that comes through a technology platform that we're launching right now, which is to give alerts and communications. So upstream, they have an understanding of there's a fire in a resin manufacturer, and here are the main products that resin goes to, and we can anticipate a shortage here, and here are cross-references for alternative product that's been deemed clinically acceptable that you can divert to when and where possible. To Middle's point, there's sometimes no alternatives, but hopefully we've addressed upstream and required that supplier, if it's a sole source, to have more than one source of raw material, if it's a critical raw material like butadiene or resin or something of that nature. So it's really rewiring things on the front end and then more proactively communicating on the back end.
I feel like that was such a good, clear explanation. And I really like the example of the sharps containers. That was actually something that I wrote about a couple of months ago early on in the newsletter. And I think it is interesting because it demonstrates exactly what you're saying. Like, number one, you got to go as far up the supply chain as possible, because if you don't have security on the sort of the who's sourcing your suppliers, then you don't actually have as much diversity as you thought. But I also really like the example of how you're, looking upstream and looking downstream. You have to do sort of both of those things to make the transparency really effective. And it's both the communicating upstream about like making sure that there's some diversity in the raw materials suppliers, make sure there's diversity in the product suppliers. And then it seems like part of what you're saying is like the more information you have up there, the more you can communicate downstream to, there's a fire at a resin plant. Hey, member hospitals, that might cause a problem because we know that serves this product. It's gonna, but we've got some time where we can maybe figure this out. Or ahead of time, maybe you realize, hey, you only have one resin supplier. Maybe we should get 2 to be a part of this program. It sounds like part of that.
And that's exactly right, Matt. You laid it out in the right path, and it's really ensuring we have line of sight. And it's interesting. We see a lot of media coverage and interest in domestic production, for example, and we certainly support that, though we believe availability is the number 1 criteria and will remain so for a while for these essential supplies. Number 2 is quality, and number 3 is price. At some point, it will revert and price will be number 1 again. So we're conscious of the price point, but when we look at this discussion around domestic supply, we fear sometimes that folks don't grasp what we were just talking about. That is great if you stand up a manufacturer of any product. But if it's one manufacturing plant with one raw material source, it's not vertically integrated, you haven't created that resiliency. You haven't created the redundancy. And that could be related to pandemics, but it could be related to any number of things, like the resin manufacturer caught on fire, or you have hurricanes and tornadoes. If you're going to be a domestic supplier, where's your other plant? Where's your other source for resin or whatever the raw material is? So it's really looking at all of those characteristics, documenting those, again, incorporating in our contracting and more proactively communicating out. So these things aren't rumors and trumors, but we have facts and we can go back to point of origin.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and I really like, a lot of times when people bring up domestic supply chain, one of the things I think about is Puerto Rico, and you mentioned hurricanes and Hurricane Maria, because I know that was, on the one hand, you might think, oh, Puerto Rico, American territory, right there off the coast. That feels like bringing things closer could bring more security. But if you put all of your suppliers on one island and there's a big hurricane, that could be a problem. So just good to be on top of all of that. So I want to move on to this second point that you guys talked about, Vizient talks about on the website, this aspect of accountability. And I think we've already started to get into this a little bit, but what are to be a part of this Nova Plus enhanced program, what are suppliers required to do to be a part of this? How do you make sure they're complying with those requirements?
Yeah, Matt, I can take a stab at it from a pharmacy perspective, and David certainly can chime in from our PPE and supply chain perspective. But really, for our pharmacy suppliers and the vendors who participate in the program, what we do is we give them transparency as to what our members' demand is or what our members' purchases are, and in turn, the members also have a high level of commitment. So I said, the Nova Plus program that we've had for years, there's been very, very strong commitment from our health systems that participate with Vizient under this program. And that's what we're leveraging to give our suppliers who participate in the program insight into what the member demand is. Now, based on that demand or historical purchase of those members, we provide our suppliers what the units are. And based on those units, the supplier is required to create up to 6 months of additional inventory. And I think that's what creates that additional resiliency, as in you don't know when that next hurricane is going to happen or next earthquake or whatever natural disaster or pandemic we want to talk about. But that's what allows us to have that resiliency in place in case there is an unanticipated disruption. And when the supplier looks at what the demand has been for that specific product, they know that ahead of time. They know that in return, they are getting the members consistent commitment going forward as well. They know how to plan that production. And on top of that, we are bringing additional supply to market, right? We're creating not an alternate source of manufacturing, but we're actually creating more product in case your day-to-day product has any kind of interruption.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really good description of how it's kind of a two-way street. You got to have the commitment from the hospital side to say, we know what we typically need. We can tell you, we can give you those numbers and give you a sense of that. But then it sounds like the point of this sort of enhanced program is to go, okay, here's sort of the baseline where we're always at. We want you to go above that. So, to provide that buffer, to provide that security. And so that's, it's, and I think you said 6 months was the way to do that. So I wanted to bring up something specific. This is something that I'm just interested because this was a conversation that I had about drug shortages a couple of months ago when I was writing about it. I was talking to a researcher named Hui Zhao. She's at Penn State, I think. And she had this really interesting paper that I read about failure to supply clauses. And basically she was making the argument that like, if you're a drug manufacturer, there's not like a huge penalty if you don't supply. Like if someone orders and you say, well, sorry, we're out. And so basically she was proposing but you could incorporate into these contracts some sort of failure to supply clause where there's, you're penalized for this. And I was just interested, because you guys are in a position to actually, know what the realities of that are. Is that something that, you think could work for Vizient or other GPOs? And, how would that affect sort of the resiliency of the supply chain?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll let David chime in too. But at the same time, we've had these clauses within our agreements, even under the NOAA Plus program. What we've done is under the NOAA Plus Enhanced Supply program, we've even strengthened further those clauses based on the information we know about drug shortages. I just shared with you the numbers that our members pay more than just purchasing a higher price product. So failure to supply really comes in as you have a contract for one product that supplier can't provide. And if our health system is trying to order that product and they can't get it, then they have to purchase a product at a higher price. The failure to supply clauses that the health system would be reimbursed for that price difference, right? And what we are trying to encompass is now there's a lot of the times they're not just paying for the higher product, higher price product, but there's a lot of labor cost associated with paying for that. And there's also uncaptured costs today. There's canceled procedures. There is potential medication errors that happen as a result of drug shortages. There's a lot of costs that go beyond just the price of the product in procurement. And we're trying to look at capturing a lot more of that. Also, our health systems also have to sometimes utilize 503B compounding facilities to purchase alternate products too. And those are a lot of those costs that we're trying to encompass into this new program as well. So we're trying to go even beyond the typical failure to supply clause in order to assure that our health systems are made whole. But at the same time, I also think that having this additional resiliency created through having up to 6 months of additional inventory also protects the supplier as well. So in case they do run into a production challenge, we've seen that a lot of the drug shortages, majority of them get resolved within 3 to 6 months. So if you're already having a resiliency within your system and you're not just managing just-in-time inventory and you have up to 6 months of additional inventory for a large group of members that have commitment through you, hopefully you're not running into these failure to supply clauses and avoiding that cost as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. David, it looked like you had something to add there too.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I'll build on what Middle said. She's absolutely right. And where she's going with that is failure to supply is great. Of course, we have binding language in our contract. We have it in all our contracts, and we certainly enhanced it for Nova Plus Enhanced Supply. But the reality is we don't want to trigger that language. The whole goal of this game is to never have to trigger that. So to Middle's point, it's what are we doing to better protect the supplier, quite frankly, that manufacturer and or distributor, and what we're calling the member, the provider, be that an acute or non-acute site. And so we're working on both sides of that equation, which frankly is a lot of what we do in our position is we're managing this two-sided market, the buyer and the seller. And part of this resiliency, part of this transparency around origin of products, raw materials that we talked about, and then having that technical term slack I talked about in the line, the 6 months, or you look at the 200% allocation, is things will happen. But at the end of the day, what we really care about is that our members get the product that they wanted. We don't want them to have alternative product, and we don't want the supplier to have to pay any kind of fee or damage. And the reality of a pandemic is you're going to trigger force majeure language. So let's actually retool our processes to better protect and ensure that supply we talked about, so we never get to failure to supply. Really, it's a failure if we got to that point. And so what do we do to buffer ourselves from that? And on the member side, that is going to include identifying what is an alternative product or set of products through their value analysis team, what's clinically acceptable. It's ensuring they have moved away from the JIT, the just-in-time that Middle talked about. And many of them are looking at 90 days, 6 months, some of them 365 days of safety stock. So we're protecting on both sides of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Guys, we are coming up right onto the edge of our time here. So I think that's all the time we have for questions today. Thanks to Middle and David for joining me on the show today. Listeners, this is part 1 of a 2-part conversation. So we'll pick up right where we left off next week on Thursday. This has been Medically Necessary. Thanks for listening.